Good evening, and welcome to American Public Square at Jewell. I'm Adam Erickson, Membership Coordinator for this and Roving Reporter for this evening's program. I'd like to start by thanking everyone who made this program possible, including the American Public Square Program Committee, the Membership Committee, and all the staff and volunteers at APS. I'd also like to thank our sponsors for tonight's program. These sponsors are William Jewell College, Marnie and John Sherman, the City of Kansas City, Missouri, the Hall Family Foundation, the H&R Block Foundation, Sue Seidler and Louis Nerman, and Plexpod. Tonight, we'll be discussing the newly released documentary, Unrepresented. You've all had a special opportunity to view this film online, and American Public Square at Jewell has brought together this panel to have a conversation about this important issue. Allow me to introduce our panel for tonight's discussion. Joining us will be Rodney, writer and executive producer of Unrepresented, entrepreneur, author, and leading voice in the independent community, Greg Orman, professor of communications at USC and UC Berkeley, and former director of communications for Senator John McCain, Dan Schnur, and William Jewell professor of political science, Dr. Allan Holiman. And our moderator for this evening will be Ambassador Allan Katz. As always, during American Public Square programming, we welcome questions from the audience. As roving reporter, I will be watching for any questions you may have for our panelists, so please feel free to type those into the Q&A section of Zoom. If you're watching through Facebook, you may also ask your questions by posting them on our official APS page. With that, I will turn it over to our moderator for the evening. Oh, muted.
You've got to unmute.
I'm sorry about that. Let's be starting again. Thank you all for being here. I want to thank those who are attending, our panelists in particular. I appreciate you all participating in this with us. And at American Public Square, as those of you who know us know that we are an organization which believes that civil discourse and facts actually will improve the quality of our government and our life in general. So I appreciate you all being part of it. So I'd like to start this evening with to hear from you, Andrew, because you made this film. There was a reason that you wrote it and what you wanted to accomplish with it. So with that, why don't you let us know what that was?
Sure. I was just like everybody or many people on this. I just was hoping to make some difference, but I was inspired to do it because the first documentary that I made, and I got into documentary films because my best friend who directed this was a documentary film maker, but the first film that we made together was about Detroit, which is where I'm from. And as most will know, it's had a tremendously difficult last 40 years, 40, 50 years. And, but where we had grown up, a little bit outside of the city, most people didn't understand why and didn't understand the history. And we wanted to make a documentary about why that was. And in making that, what we saw and in trying to explain it and get into the history, was often that we were running into federal policies that just didn't make sense and that were causing a lot more harm than they were good over time, and things that really should have been changed, but for some reason they weren't being changed. And so we finished that documentary, we released it, but I still had these continuing questions about and a desire to explain them. So I continued to research. I got more involved in different groups. I tried to, make a change as best I could, and I found in doing so and interacting with people that I kept running into a lot of people that didn't understand or weren't, in a lot of cases, like we're trying to do here, to have a civil discussion about a complex issue. There were a lot of people who have been polarized and just weren't able to discuss what was fundamentally causing this breakdown in our governments from top to bottom that we were experiencing. So after doing enough research, being involved enough, learning enough, I said, I turned to my friend, the director, Daniel Faulkner, and I said, I think that it's time that we make another documentary that could be used, to help educate and encourage discussions better, all across the country.
Thank you. So from this, Greg Orman, you brought this to our attention, for which we're very thankful. What do you think was the most important message coming out of this film?
Well, it's interesting. Obviously, the issue of how our political system is rigged by big moneyed interest is something I've been talking about for quite some time. And it's one of the reasons that Andrew's work was so appealing to me. But the thing that I hadn't really considered in the whole idea of how rigged our system is how Washington's ability to print money allows it all to happen. Because if we weren't able to run basically unsustainable budget deficits, we would find ourselves in a position where all these special interests would be fighting with each other for a defined pie instead of going to Washington, D.C. and creating the sort of incentives that allow them to all get what they want. And, I've often said that Democrats and Republicans don't work together anymore. And when they do, it's generally in service of screwing the American people. And I think this documentary sort of pointed that out very clearly. And so I think that connection to the ability to print unlimited money, run unlimited budget deficits, and how that allows this system in part to persist was a compelling piece of the argument that I hadn't previously considered.
Thank you. Daniel, you are I believe you describe yourself currently as an independent, but certainly a former Republican. And as I recall from days gone by, the deficit was a Republican issue. And basically deficit spending was looked down upon, and basically Democrats were being upbraided by the Republicans for not balancing the budget. In fact, many of them signed onto a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. Imagine where we'd be now if that were in place. What's changed?
One of the concepts that I discuss with my students in my classes is a concept that I call selective and situational outrage. And when it comes to deficit spending, it's a lot easier to be outraged when the other party is in control running the deficit than when it becomes your responsibility. And this does work on both sides of the aisle, but in this case, as you correctly pointed, Allan, is under Democratic presidents, Republicans express great concern, if not great outrage, about the level of government spending and the deficits that are the result of that spending. They become much less concerned when either additional spending or tax reductions cause the kind of deficit increases we've seen over the last few years. If I can, though, I want to be presumptuous enough, Allan, to answer the question that you asked Greg about what I liked best about Andrew's movie, because I really thought it was just tremendous. Andrew, you and your colleagues did just a phenomenal job. You ought to be very, very proud of it. And for anyone who's watching this conversation who hasn't yet had a chance to watch the movie, I can't tell you how strongly I'd recommend it. What struck me most about it, aside from the thrust of the overall message, is the work that Andrew and his colleagues did to make it clear that this was a bipartisan affliction. And if you go back to this conversation, this concept I mentioned a moment ago about selective outrage, it's really easy for Democrats to rage at Republicans, Republican and conservative special interests. It's equally easy for Republicans to rage about left-leaning Democrat or progressive special interests. But unless or until Americans decide that a poisoned political system has roots in both parties at both extremes, we're going to be too divided to do anything to make the system better. And one of the hardest things about politics is taking on the people on your own side when they do wrong. And I think the terrific thing about a movie like this is it makes it clear that if we're going to fix a broken system, it requires us to stand up to our own allies, not just our already existing enemies.
No, I think that's a very good point. And Allan Holiman, you've been teaching political science for 20 some odd years. And so I would ask you the following question. One, what did you think was the most important part of this documentary? And also, have you seen an increase in cynicism among your students towards the process?
I agree with Greg about the connection about debt and the dysfunction of the system. I agree with Dan very much about the way that this film holds out the dilemma that this is a bipartisan problem that our system faces. I think one thing that struck me in the system was Justin Amash talking about the sheer difficulty of doing the job. Constantly having to raise money, unable to read bills because of the way that the chamber organizes itself internally. And it seems that the people that we need to fix the system are those who are part of the problem. And the thing that struck me was, and I wish the film had addressed it a little bit more, why do so many people want a legislative career? It was originally intended this would be a public service. You do it for a while. You don't stay there till you're 86. What is the incentive to stay? If it's so hard to raise the money and the workload is so bad and you're so fresh, why do so many people hold on to it by the bloody tips of their fingernails? And I think we as citizens need to talk about that. And talking about students, I've seen lots more cynicism. I taught a course this last semester on American democracy. Democracy American Style is what it was called. And at the end of the semester, I asked the students to rate what they consider the quality of our republic to be on a scale of 1 to 10. 10 being a very good functioning democracy, 1 being god awful. And our dear country scored about a 4. That was the greatest grade. And I found that truly depressing. And it shows that we all have a lot of work to do. So I think it's a great effort. It's a great effort. And you laid out a lot of complex problems very, very clearly. I'm looking forward to the second version of the film that goes into a lot of other things I wanted to ask you about.
Okay, thank you.
Alan, do you mind if I respond to
Go
Alan's
ahead.
comment?
Please.
You know, I've spent a lot of time trying to recruit candidates to run for office, and I'm generally trying to get them to run as independents, and that sort of creates a whole nother layer of complexity. But I think it was telling. I had a conversation with someone who had been very successful in business, had decided, you know, for the longest time, 3 decades, his wife told me, he wanted to be in Congress or to be a United States senator. And so I spent a lot of time trying to get him to run for office. And he finally came to the conclusion that he didn't want to run. And when I asked him why, he said, well, you know, right now we control our life, we control our schedule, we get to go where we want to go, when we want to go. I just don't think it will improve my life. And I said to him, you know, if that's the case, you shouldn't run, because being a United States senator should not be about improving your life. It should be about improving other people's lives. That's the definition of public service. And it's not public service if it's the best job you're ever going to have. And I think for far too many people in Washington, and I am a cynic about most people in Washington, but for far too many people in Washington, it is the best job they're going to ever have. It's the highest pay. It's the route to a potential job in lobbying. They've got 20 or 30 people at their beck and call at all times. People call them senator or representative. They get a lot of psychic value out of that. And so I think it gets to sort of another issue, which is we have a system that does not attract the best people. And the reason they want to hold on to these jobs that seemingly to many of us would seem like they're difficult jobs to do and maybe frustrating, and you could even describe them as terrible jobs, is it's because it's the best job they're ever going to have. And you know, it's unfortunate to have to say that, and I realize that's not a very polite thing to say in a forum where we're supposed to politely discuss things. But as I was thinking about Andrew's movie, you know, the suffragettes, the people who fought for civil rights, you know, they were all told to sit down, to be quiet, to know your place, to be polite. And ultimately, that didn't get anybody anywhere. And so I think, you know, Allan, part of the reason they hold on to these jobs is it's the best job they're ever going to have.
You know, let me just sort of move over to Dan for a second here, because now I worked in Washington back in the 70s, worked on Capitol Hill. And actually, among the people I worked for, my sense at the time, and you know, we're always worried about looking backwards and sort of with rose-colored glasses about what the past used to be. But there were, I think, a significant number of members of Congress who saw this as basically a public service, who really liked what they did, and they did it very well. Actually, the local representative here, Dick Bowling, for example, was probably one of the real giants in the House of Representatives, which would probably fall into that category. But Dan, your experience, you've been around politics a long time. You worked for John McCain. Respond to what Greg just said. Is that something of the past, or was that always there that way, you think?
Well, I think you make a good point, Allan, which is we do tend to look at the past toward through rose-colored glasses. And there's always been partisanship. There's always been special interests. But historically, there's been an ability for our leaders in both parties to rise above those challenges when it becomes absolutely necessary. And that's much more difficult today than ever before. I talk in my classes about Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan working together to to save Social Security. I talk to them about Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton working together on welfare reform. I may as well be talking to them about my favorite blacksmith and my old 8-track tape player. They don't doubt that I'm telling them the truth, but it's such a historical distance. It is irrelevant to their lives. And to go back to the point that Allan Holiman was discussing earlier, what I think's happened over the years, particularly when it comes to young people, and if any of your students are watching this, I hope they'll weigh in with questions and comments on this also. But what I see in my classes is that when I began teaching in the 1990s, many young people, most young people, were cynical about politics. Since then, they've moved from cynical to absolute disregard and disdain. In other words, the traditional political system that you and I came up through is simply no longer relevant to them. And if you look at the data, you see, of course, that the millennials and Generation Z vote in smaller numbers than any generation in America today or in recent American history. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you see also that these generations volunteer their time back into their communities at greater levels than any generation we've seen in quite some time. And the reason for that, if you talk to these young people, if you talk to the students and you listen to them, is they believe in community service. They believe in public service. But even if they haven't seen Andrew's movie, what they intuit is that there are rich people who, even if my student gets 1 vote, that rich special interest on the left or the right gets 1 million votes, or 10 million votes, or 50 million votes. And rather than fight that system, they'd simply rather clean up a park.
Okay, Andrew, I want to get back to you for a second. There was a very famous speaker of the California legislature named Jesse Unruh. And Jesse Unruh, very famous. First, he said, of course, that money was the mother's milk of politics. This was back in the 70s or 80s, I believe. But he also said, if you can't, drink their booze, take their money, and still vote against them, you don't belong in politics. So in putting together this documentary, do you think you discovered a change? Has it evolved? Or was it sort of always this way, but we didn't have social media and we didn't have as much transparency?
I think it's always been this way, and I think one of the major points the documentary makes is just how exponentially it has changed in the last 60 years, where there's always been problems, but when you have a system where the money that those special interests are spending to get their way is coming from the government without having to be taken from the people, without having to be appropriated, taxed, without it coming from the people, and the money is going to the special interests, and then the special interests have to just reinvest a portion of it back in, then suddenly you have this system which is completely unchecked. Because back in early American, we've had horrendous problems in American history, but there still was an ethic at times of kind of maybe they could have always printed untold amount of money. During big conflicts you always can, but there was an ethic that right after World War II, Harry Truman started trying to just level off where they were at, but as America's credit card became unlimited, as the United States dollar became the world currency, and as technological progress just continued to advance, and we just developed so much more spending power, and you see that the spending, the benefits to spend were just so much greater. To get a lobbyist in Washington, to get to be involved in Washington, D.C. just became so much more tempting. And there's a Lee Drutman writes very well about it in the growth of lobbying, that how you see in the 60s, 70s, there's the evolution of it where it became, it started off as defensive, where there was a lot of lobbying that happened because a lot of groups that weren't involved just learned that, they could lose a tremendous amount by not being represented. So they started paying for representation, and then they found they could make a lot of money from being represented. So they started paying for more representation. And now in the last 20 years, we're at a point where the amount that you can make from having representation in Washington is so enormous that people are just going, putting in huge amounts of money for that. And then we're not being asked to pay for that through our taxes. So the people just don't know what's going on. And I think that explains what, you, Dan, explained with students' lack of involvement, is that it's just like, we have no idea what's going on. And so, we don't feel it. When I was in college and we invaded Iraq, there was no request for a tax increase. This all just happened on the news. There might have known a few people that were going off to war. But it really didn't, if you didn't know people that were directly involved in the war, it didn't hit you at home. And that's where it seems like the news is just in Washington are more a foreign thing to most people, I would say, in America. So it hasn't changed, but it's just grown exponentially.
Right. Well, okay. And just to your point, there was a move after we invaded Iraq. My former boss, David Obey, who at the time was chairman of the Appropriations Committee, introduced an amendment for a war tax, which I believe got about 40 votes on both sides of the aisle. Let's go to some questions now. Adam, you got some questions from some of our list of people who are
Yeah. Several of our audience members have commented, as both the film and this discussion right now has talked about, as kind of the duopoly of the two parties. And they wanted to know, is there any way for an independent movement or some sort of third party to help either remedy, this problem? How would that look, and what would it take to start an effective movement like that?
Okay, Greg, you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, sure, happy to. So yes, there's a real need for an independent movement. I think the two-party system, the duopoly, is irreparably broken. And unless we create a third force in our politics, we really are not going to get past the sort of blue-red paradigm we have today. And so, unfortunately, that's a very hard thing to do for a number of reasons. Number one, the rules are rigged against independents. Not surprisingly, when you allow Democrats and Republicans to write the rules of the game, they write them in a way that advantages Democrats and Republicans. In fact, I wrote a book, and one of the chapters in the book, I talked about this, and I used a baseball analogy because the Kansas City Royals had just won the World Series, but I suggested what would happen if every year the team that won the pennant in each division got the opportunity to change one rule, but only have it apply to them. The Kansas City Royals would get 4 outs and everybody else would get 3. Well, eventually the Kansas City Royals would win the World Series every year. And that's what's happened in our politics. As an example, if an independent wanted to run for the US Senate over a 2-year period of time, they could collect $5,800 from an average citizen. That same average citizen can give $830,000 a year to the Democratic or the Republican Party. Not to any other party, but to the Democratic or the Republican Party. In fact, if you go back to 1974, when the FEC was created, they put limits on what you could contribute. $1,000 as an individual. You could give $5,000 to a party, unless it was a major party, i.e. the Democrats or Republicans, then you could give $25,000. So even in the height of reform zeal, they made sure to give themselves a 5-to-1 advantage. So a whole series of rules have been written in a way to make it hard to keep competition out. The second thing is psychological. The two greatest attacks on independents are they're going to spoil the race, and so you shouldn't vote for them, number one. And there is this sort of vicious cycle, because until you get above a certain level in the polls, the press won't cover you. If they keep saying you're going to spoil the race and you can't win, they can suppress you in the polls. and it sort of makes it very difficult for them to come forward. And then the second big attack is we don't know where they stand on the issues. And I was actually talking to Howard Schultz last year when he was thinking about running for president as an independent. Dan was in that meeting with me, and they were talking about needing to kick out policy papers. And I said, with all due respect, Howard, you could have 1,000 pages of policy on your website. They're still going to say we don't know where Howard Schultz stands on the issues. Because people aren't going to take the time in their busy lives to go and research it. And we sort of intuitively think we know what it means to be a Democrat or a Republican, so we don't bother. So there are some real impediments. I do believe the presidential contest is a potential way where this could change. And I understand there are a lot of people concerned about this race, and every presidential contest is always billed as the most important in our history. And this one, may in fact be that. But the presidential contest is a contest where you, in theory, could mobilize a lot of people behind a candidate. And I think that's an important part of this. And then in the presidential contest, you need to get to 15% in the polls to get in the presidential debates. And 83 million Americans on average watched both of the all three of the presidential debates in 2016. That's a huge platform that if someone did a great job, they may be able to build a groundswell of support behind them. But I think we saw this, if you look at the difference between the Tea Party and the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Tea Party had an impact because it organized behind candidates. Occupy Wall Street really didn't until they found their candidate in Bernie Sanders in 2016. And so I think it really does have to come, and the movement really has to be organized around candidates. We have to work to change the structural impediments. That's why I support things like ranked choice voting. That's why we're working to raise awareness around opportunities for independence. But ultimately, Democrats and Republicans have been very rational and very dedicated for a long period of time in pursuit of one thing, and that is getting their people elected. And for an independent movement to take hold, those of us who care about it have to be equally rational, equally dedicated, and recognize it's going to take decades, not years.
Okay, thank you. You got another question for me, Adam?
Yes. One of our viewers wanted to know, they said that, the themes of this film and kind of this duopoly seems to kind of mirror like a college fraternity where there are legacies and kind of it's people, families and these political insiders who keep, rising through the ranks and getting power. And so they wanted to know, does this problem persist or is it across race and gender and all of these other lines besides just kind of the two parties?
Okay, Andrew, you want to take a crack at that?
I would love to, but I think, Allan, do you feel, I know that you study a lot of European history, but maybe.
Okay, Al, yeah, great. Allan, jump in there. Go ahead. Don't be shy.
I'm not sure what the question is asking.
I think the question is basically, are there legacy issues that basically keep things the way they are, and basically that money just reinforces?
I think so, yeah. In many cases, it's not necessarily know how, it's know who. And connections matter. And networks of connections matter. And I think Greg's right in terms of breaking up space to give third parties or independent candidates chance to get on stage and get attention is very, very important. It's one of the ways you break it up. But I was interested, one thing that struck me too about the film, and I guess we can talk about it toward the end. Andrew, you talk about the importance of reforming politics at the state level and beginning there to create a movement that can affect the situation in Washington nationally. What about if the corruption is already there in the state legislatures? Because we're having a situation in Missouri with the state legislature trying to overturn an amendment to the Constitution that the voters passed to sort of clean up gerrymandering.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yes. Sometimes the problem at the state capitol is no better.
Certainly, no. We are happy to talk about that. But answer the question of the viewer. Of course, I mean, it's like a family business. I think there's a great book on the Bush family. I can't remember the title. Maybe it's just called Bushes or something like that. But mm-hmm. it's just about the three generations, and of course it's self-reinforcing. It's like any family business. If your family business is politics, then that's it. If your family business is political consulting, then you're going to have if people stay dedicated and work very hard. And if you're a banker who trades in treasury bonds, and those are going well, it's naturally a self-perpetuating problem.
Okay, well, let me sort of steer this partially over towards Dan for a second here. We talk about money in politics and the impact of it. There are a number of people, in the Bushes are a good example of a family that frankly didn't need the money, okay? They didn't need to become a lobbyist after they were serving in office. They served, and whether or not we agreed or disagreed with their policies along the way, whether the Bushes or the Kennedys or who, there are certain families that seem the money is not the moving force in their life. Do we see some of that, more of that coming along, or has that kind of all gone away?
I'll go back to a point that Greg made earlier, which is for too many people in politics in Washington and state capitals, being an elected representative is the best and, more alarmingly, the most lucrative job they'll ever have. And I'm not suggesting for a minute that only wealthy people should run for office out of a sense of public service. But if people see public service as a professional / financial achievement for them, it's going to be a lot easier for a special interest in either party to turn their head. If I may, Allan, I'd like to go back to the previous question, because just seeing the Q&A online, I read, I believe, Kathy Bale's question a little bit differently about demographic engagement in these issues. And as she points out correctly, we happen to be a panel of white men. But what I would say is this, is that underrepresented minority communities, female voters, voters with other gender identities, the stakes are even higher in those communities. Because if the system is run by powerful insiders, those voices that have been habitually excluded are going to have an even tougher time being heard. Here in California, and I can't speak for the rest of the country with the same authority, I'm proud to say that some of the most respected voices in the reform movement, Kathy Fang of Common Cause, Astrid Ochoa Garcia of Future of California Elections, Mindy Romero of the California Civic Engagement Project, do speak for these underrepresented communities, not specifically, but as part of a broader overall reform message. I think ultimately, if this effort is going to succeed, while I personally and somewhat self-servingly find this panel fascinating, ultimately we're going to succeed when a conversation like this one looks a lot more like the rest of America. Because while Allan and Greg and Andrew and Allan and I all have a tremendous amount to gain from the kind of reform of the system that the movie talks about, voters or non-voters in those underrepresented communities have much, much more to gain.
And I think that's a very good point. And this is sort of an exceptionally, you should forgive the phrase, white male panel for American Public Square. It came together this way, but it is unusual for us. But I appreciate the point that people make, and I appreciate that your point, I think it's a valid one. I think that, Adam, you got another question for us?
Yeah, we've had quite a few people ask about, as was mentioned earlier, a lot of especially younger people are more focused on doing community things. Maybe they're distancing themselves from politics. But one of the topics that was brought up in the movie was the idea of things like vouchers that would allow people to kind of support their candidate. People had some more questions about those. Is that actually an efficacious method to remedy this problem, and things like, where would the money from those vouchers come? Is there other solutions that kind of work on a more state or local level, as opposed to just trying to change this problem at the very highest federal level?
Andrew, you want to take that?
Sure. I think that starting at that local level is the right way to go. And vouchers, we weren't proposing we were trying to issue a bunch of proposals for this is how you solve the country. We were trying to show viewers these are ways that different cities, states, organizations are trying to solve things at the local level. And vouchers are certainly one of the more popular and supported measures, though Seattle and New York are probably the two largest actual entities that are trying them now. And in terms of efficaciousness, I mean, it's to be seen. You know, the laboratories of democracy, right? Is the saying for the states, and I think that vouchers are being tested out. When you talk to some independent candidates, they tell you the great benefit of them, because when you're an incumbent, you get enormous support from whatever, you know, lobby or interest group just wants your support, you know, and when you're not, then you're how do I raise this money? I'm trying to talk directly to the people. So I think that it's a great concept, but I don't think that it's been definitely proven. It's a great opportunity, but not one that I've seen personally that I could say that's the way to go. And especially, I wouldn't support things at a federal level until it's been proven out a little bit more on the state and local scene.
Okay, let me just sort of say a couple quick things, because I think that we need to give for some context. First of all, we did have a balanced budget in this country, 1999, 2000, last 2 years of the Clinton administration, we actually had a surplus. Most people forget that, and so to the extent that that somehow leads to the bad behavior, or sort of you know, increases the bad behavior, maybe it's not always the case, because I think the behavior was fairly bad in those periods, or similar in those periods of time. The second thing is we've had a wide series of different efforts at public financing. In fact, federal elections, presidential elections, were always federal. We're always had public dollars, and really that was changed when Obama chose to abandon the system in the general election of 2008, which became a strategic political decision, and the outcome of it, you know, may have been obviated by the decision in 2010 on Citizens United. But the reality is that the days when a candidate spent $50 to $100 million on a national presidential campaign are over. So what I wonder about here is what adjustments would you make, Greg, on the dollar side of this to deal with the problem that we've got?
Well, you know, a few things. And Andrew appropriately pointed out that if you're an incumbent, raising money becomes transactional in nature. And in fact, in the documentary, they talked about people spending 25 or 30 hours a week while Congress is in session in call rooms. We recently did some polling that's part of a series of polls that have been done over the last 2 decades about how Americans think about certain things. And we tested 3 things as they related to this issue of fundraising. One is 82% of American people believe that Congress should be prevented from raising money while Congress is in session. A wide group of Americans, wide majorities of both Democrats and Republicans, believe that when you're in the nation's capital doing the people's work, you shouldn't be in cocktail parties and call rooms raising money. You should be in committee hearings and engaged in the people's work that you get paid $175,000 a year to do. We also talked about preventing lobbyists from bundling contributions, making contributions, or holding fundraisers on behalf of federal candidates. 85% of Americans, again, wide majority of Democrats and Republicans, believe we should do that. And that's about sending a really simple message, which is, you know, we believe in the First Amendment. If you want to provide information, if you want to lobby, that's fine, but our government's not for sale. And then finally, big majorities, in fact, again, well over 80% of Americans believe we should have a lifetime ban on lobbying for members of Congress. Again, Congress shouldn't be a stepping stone to a 6 or 7 figure job lobbying your former colleagues. I know we'd all love to see Citizens United, or many of us would like to see Citizens United overturned. This idea that a corporation is a person and therefore entitled to the free speech protections of the Constitution just doesn't seem relevant and doesn't seem accurate. In fact, I would argue that's what the Merrick Garland confirmation lack of hearing was all about. I think Mitch McConnell held up Obama's choice of a Supreme Court nominee not because of social issues that he was concerned the court may engage in. I think he was afraid Citizens United would be overturned, and with it, a big source of funding for his party. So, ultimately, love to see a constitutional amendment on Citizens United, but I think there are lots of things that we could do. to end the transactional nature of fundraising in Washington. Unfortunately, and a point that Allan Holiman raised earlier, something like that requires the consent of the victims. The folks in Washington, D.C. who are benefiting from the system today are the ones who are going to have to approve that. And my suspicion is Speaker Pelosi and Senate Majority Leader McConnell, they want their caucus members in those call rooms. There's no way they're going to advocate for something like that changes that system.
Let me just say one thing before we go to the next question, and that is that Florida, when I lived in Florida, passed a rule that state legislators could not have fundraisers when the legislature was in session. Consequently, the night before they went into session, everyone had a fundraiser, and the night after they went out of session, everyone had a fundraiser. So I guess, and my point, the larger point really is we have to assume people who want to figure out a way around this are going to figure out a way around it in terms of trying to those people that money's going to influence. Okay, so Adam, you got another question for us?
Yes. We've had several people ask about kind of campaign finance reform and Citizens United. And one of the topics of the film was that maybe one of the reasons that's never got a lot of traction is because, unlike other movements, they didn't kind of articulate what that would mean in terms of policy changes. So is that a way to kind of solve these problems if people could come together on that specific topic? Or is there another issue that people can rally behind that could directly, you can see the benefits if this movement passes? Is that a way that if people who watch this film and want to do something, is there something to it? Or is there another way that people either at the local or higher levels need to start coming together as a coalition?
Allan, if I can take a crack at that. Adam, I think it's a terrific question, and I can answer from the context of the time I spent on Senator McCain's campaign in 2000, when campaign finance reform was one of the primary focuses of that campaign. What I learned that year, or over those 2 years, is that if for the average American, if you recite the words campaign finance reform in succession enough times, you will put even the most caffeinated audience in the world to sleep without much problem whatsoever. Incidentally, the word reapportionment is a more efficient way of accomplishing the same goal. But what you learn from both is that for people like us who care enough about political reform to watch a movie like Andrew's and to engage in conversations like this one, we are, I'll say politely, somewhat outliers in the overall community. And what I learned that year is that any political reform effort, whether it be campaign finance or any other type of structural change you think is important, will only engage the broader electorate if it's tied very specifically to a matter of public policy. And I think the most important thing for anyone who cares deeply about political reform is to realize that for most people, no offense intended, to most normal people, political reform is not an end. It's a means to an end. And for most normal people, better schools for their children, safer communities, cleaner air and water are the goals. And it's incumbent upon the reformers to explain how their reform will help the average citizen achieve that goal. If I may, Allan, just to go on for one more minute, I'll tell you a quick story from my very first day on the campaign trail of Senator McCain. I'd not even moved back to Washington yet. I'd taken the job, and he was out in California in Silicon Valley campaigning. He did a town hall meeting at Intel up in Silicon Valley, and he talked at some length about campaign finance reform. And the first question from a young woman was about a patient's Bill of Rights. And I will never forget the senator's answer. What John McCain said is, he said, I agree with you on the merits of a patient's Bill of Rights, and he laid out 3 or 4 key criteria. Then the young woman and others in the audience were nodding. And he said, but it's never going to happen. He said, it's never going to happen because my party, the Republican Party, is a wholly owned subsidiary of the insurance companies and the HMOs. And the Democratic Party is owned and operated by the trial lawyers. So when it comes time to draft healthcare policy in Washington, D.C., who sits at that table? The HMOs and the insurance companies and the trial lawyers. Who doesn't sit at that table? You don't sit at that table, miss. You don't sit at that table, sir. No one in this room sits at that table because you don't write multi-million-dollar checks. If you help me pass campaign finance reform, I will get you your patient's Bill of Rights. But until we change the way campaigns are financed in this country, no American woman is going to be able to afford to is going to be able to pick her own obstetrician or her own gynecologist because the legislation won't permit for it. So by taking a very abstract, ethereal issue of campaign finance reform and tying it to a very concrete healthcare policy matter, he was able to demonstrate to voters how that issue could be a means to an end. And so what I would say to the question that Adam read on behalf of our audience member is the issue can be almost any: job creation, environmental protection, education, public safety. But if voters see how your reform will make their and their families' lives better in a not abstract but tangible way, that's the way you build public support for reform. Full stop.
And taking your point, is that the reason you would, and the rest of you jump in here, this year, when Elizabeth Warren, the centerpiece of her campaign was corruption. She said corruption at least 3 times in every speech that she gave, and the campaign finance system was used in some ways as the centerpiece of that, but it never really got any traction. You think it's because there was she didn't reduce it down to how you're going to have better schools?
It was an abstraction, and it's one that infuriates people. Everyone hates corruption. Everyone hates special interests, but they vote on much more tangible matters that affect their daily lives. And tying that issue to one or more of those issues, I think, would have made it a much more successful exercise for her.
It's actually one of the things, Allan, that, I love this movie. I think Andrew did a great job, but as Dan mentioned, we all sort of view this thing a little bit intellectually sometimes. And I think it's been one of the issues with the reform community for the last decade is we have to get at more emotional issues. We have to capture people more around things they care about. As an example, we talk a lot in the movie about the pharmaceutical industry, the fact that they spend $300 million a year on lobbying, the fact that the lack of negotiation of prescription drug prices costs Medicare anywhere between $30 and $50 billion a year. But the real issue, the real tragedy is that it comes at the expense of people fighting oftentimes debilitating diseases. In 2018, a third of adults said that they skipped taking their prescription drugs because they couldn't afford them. 42% of new cancer patients deplete their entire net worth within the first 2 years of cancer treatment, again, because they can't afford their drugs. In fact, 1 out of 4 of them don't take their cancer drugs, life-saving drugs, because they can't afford them. And so you start thinking about those issues. 1 out of every 3 GoFundMe pages right now relates to a medical crisis. And that's what we have to reduce this to. We have to make sure people understand that there are consequences to this. It's not just this budget deficit that a lot of people don't care about, or it's hard to understand because the numbers are so big. We have to make this about real people, about real problems, about how it affects their lives, how this corrupt system is leaving so many Americans behind in so many ways. I mean, there's a reason in 2016 that 45% of all votes cast in presidential primaries went to unconventional candidates. If you think about it, median household income in America hasn't risen in 2 decades. The amount of time it takes a kid to go from being born to their sophomore or junior year in college, that's how long it's been since the average American family has had a pay increase. And at the same time, the things they spend so much money on, healthcare, childcare, higher education, have so far outstripped the rate of inflation that the average American family doesn't feel like they're treading water, they feel like they're drowning. And that's what we have to connect these reforms to. Those are the issues that we have to get at if we want this reform to be front and center. Okay,
well, let me just ask this question, because I think we all thought that the film, the documentary that Andrew created was very, very good. But I'd like to ask each of you, and just take 1 minute to give me the answer. What was the one thing in there that you either didn't like or disagreed with? And I'm going to start with Dan.
Well, there's really nothing that I didn't like. But I would, on the suggestion, as someone who doesn't know how to make documentaries, Andrew, so I say this with appropriate respect, is I would build on Greg's point, which is I think you made a very, very powerful argument, but the last step in that argument is saying, and this is why your and your family's life isn't what you would like it to be, and how it could be if these reforms were achieved. So that's maybe not a criticism of the movie, but just a plea for a sequel.
Allan, Holiman.
I agree. There was nothing in this film I didn't like. I thought it was very well done, very thoughtful, and my classes will see it, I promise. One thing, though, that I wish you that it had talked a little bit more about, and I'm going to be devil's advocate here. If you're running for office, those campaigns cost money. What are things that we can do to lower the cost of campaigns? For example, some countries require broadcasters to provide certain amounts of free media time to lessen the need to raise money. I think that would be something for us to think about. How could we lower the cost of campaigns?
Okay. Greg?
Well, I've given my principal recommendation, which is to focus more on those issues
Right.
that actually connect to people. But I would say if there's one thing I disagreed with, I don't remember who said it, but it was somewhere in the beginning where they said, Congress is corrupt, the system is corrupt, members of Congress are not. And I know it's not going to surprise anyone on this panel. I disagree with that statement. I think you got to go along to get along. You have to do this because this is how the system works. I think that's BS. And, it's not something I would accept from my 5-year-old daughter. We should not accept it from members of Congress. They should be leaders. They should be out there doing what's right for their constituents, even if it costs them their job. Public service without courage quickly becomes self-service. And I think we've got a lot of self-servants in Washington. And so if there was one thing in the movie that I say I disagree with, it was when someone made the statement that members of Congress aren't corrupt. Maybe they're not corrupt, but they're certainly cowards in most cases.
Yeah, well, let me just sort of, I thought the movie was exceptionally well done. And I think that the one point that I would raise, which sort of contradicts what Greg just said in some ways, I think there are a number of elected officials, doesn't have to be members of Congress, because this whole thing could be applied across the board. I think there are a number of people who basically solicit money from people whose views they already take when they come into office. In other words, if you're in the insurance business and you get money from the insurance industry, you probably believed their perspective in terms of the way to go about things when you got there. And therefore, I don't think that certainly makes you corrupt. I do think that, and the other larger question, though, which I think Greg raises, which is the go along to get along concept. That's an old concept that's been there for a long time, long before the money dominated things in the same pervasive way than it does today. I think the question really is how do you make it the Congress function without the impact on the way it functions by all this money? Let's go to another question. Adam, you got another one?
Yeah, as we near the end of our hour here, I think we have time for one more. Something that somebody mentioned wasn't talked a lot about in the film is the role of the fourth estate and of media in all this. What do all of you see as the media's role? I think it's an easy opinion to take that things have become more polarized, the way people view media and how the intersection of media and politics. What role do they play in this? What should we expect as citizens of a country, especially from our different media outlets, and how are they really affecting this issue?
If I can start, there. Actually, I'm sorry. I was trying to rope in the fourth estate into this documentary, but it was already so dense that it just wasn't possible to do. But I did see that the money, the largest share of campaign finances are going towards media spending. So all this growth in spending is mostly going towards communications, consultants on communications, focus groups. It's the polarization that we hear in the dialogue today is a direct effect of the amount of money that's coming into campaigns, and people don't understand that yet. They hear the messages. They don't realize how targeted they are, how much money has gone into the psychology of the message that they're hearing, where they're hearing it. And I do think that is a very, very important story there's people that are telling it, but I haven't seen it told as well as I'd like to see.
Well, I think we found the topic for your next documentary. I think that all of us would like to see something like that go forward. Let me do this because we're nearing the end of our time. I'd like to ask each of you just to address one point, which I think is an important one. And what we do, if you were to eliminate, let's suppose you were to solve the money problem. In other words, whether it's through public financing or some vouchers, whatever the actual remedy may be. And we all know that what we'll do it best is to ameliorate the situation, to make it less corrupt. It's sort of, I think, a reasonable and frankly laudable goal at this point in time. How does that help Joe citizen or Sally citizen? You know, the fact is that they've still got their life, and how are they going to have a real voice? I mean, what changes for them? Greg, you want to take a shot at that first?
Well, you know, democracy requires active participation. And so, you know, to the extent that we have a system that's more responsive to the needs of the American people, it might lead to more engagement on the part of the American people. And I think, you know, Charlie Whelan, who started an organization called the Centrist Project. It's now called Unite America. I'm on the board of Unite America for full disclosure. But he's a professor at Dartmouth, and he had a great comment on this. He said, you know, there's an old saying, you're either at the table or you're on the menu. And he was referring to the millennial generation. And he said, and in your case, you are the menu. And he said, we can't deal with politics the way we deal with a bad restaurant. You know, the way we deal with a bad restaurant is by opting out, by not going there. And ultimately, over time, it will go out of business. This one will not. And so I think if we have more responsive government, if we have government that is focused more on the needs of the American people and actually actively meeting them, instead of serving their own needs by serving the special interest and the donor community that gets them elected, I think that might lead to more citizen involvement in our government, because they will view it as being something worthwhile to spend their time on. You know, the millennial generation, we've talked about them a little bit here. It's interesting. The millennial generation is the only generation alive today that actually consumes their values. And what I mean by that is they are disproportionately more likely to patronize a company or a business if that company or business lives up to their values. And so I think they are a generation that is ripe for being engaged in politics if they feel like there's a lever they can pull to actually make a difference. Absent that, they're going to make a difference, like Dan said, by cleaning up a park or by making sure that they shop and spend their dollars at places that ultimately share their values.
Thank you. Allan, Holiman.
Well, I have to say this, given what I do for a living, but I think civic education, not just this, but starting in the schools, going all the way through school, even requiring it in higher education, to make sure that people have a better understanding of their country's history, the basic principles of economics, the plumbing, and have the ability to talk about not only how the system works, but how it ought to work, to have that equipment in their head. I always start my classes saying, you may not be interested in politics, but it doesn't mean politics isn't interested in you. And you can't run away from it. And so working on literacy throughout public education all the way to the top, you have to know more to get a driver's license than you do to vote in the United States. And we got to do a better job.
Okay. Andrew.
Yeah, in terms of what the world could look like for somebody, it's up to their imagination, because I do think that if you want to talk practically, it is what Greg touched on, which is healthcare, education, housing. I mean, those values have tripled. I mean, how much do we pay on rent? How much do we pay for healthcare? How much are you going to spend on your child's education? It shouldn't be like that. It's not like that in many countries of the world that function a lot better. And it's not a quantum leap to make that jump. It's a pretty rational decision. The incentives are just out of whack. You can point to countries that are doing it better. So I think that's practically speaking it. But if you want to touch on somebody's imagination or heart, I mean, there's so much that we could do. I mean, it's such a shame that we are continuing to debate proven facts and not just cooperating in a way that, when you're a child, you kind of hope that everybody's in charge, right? And that these rational decisions are going to get made. And then you get older and you get more involved and you say, oh, geez, these are the trade-offs and everything that I have to make. But if we change the system, the way that this country was founded, was just on this belief that if we change the system, that over the long term, incentives will get better. And they had to struggle for a long time. But, 150, 250 years almost where, things are so much better. And it's possible to really make a bright and better future. But it does start with systematic change, I think.
Thank you. Dan.
I'm going to jump on what Allan Holiman said and reinforce it. Because whether we pass campaign finance reform, redistricting reform, ranked choice voting, there are no magic answers that will automatically and immediately cause the American citizenry to become involved and engaged in the political process the way we would like them to. It took us a long time to get to this point, and it's going to take us some time to get out. So what I'll do is I'll come back to the construct I laid out earlier that Greg just alluded to, of voting versus volunteering. The idea that these young people will spend hours and hours and hours volunteering in their community, bringing meals to seniors, teaching kids to read, neighborhood watches, community cleanups, hours and hours and hours working in their communities, but not taking 15 minutes every 2 years to vote. And the truth is, and Allan alluded to this, we've programmed them for that. In my state, most public high schools require one single semester of civics for a student to graduate. One semester, that's 15 weeks of actually civics and government and geography as a crash course that they get in junior or senior year of high school, which means that the message we are delivering to our next generation of leaders, albeit unintentionally, is that this politics stuff, this government stuff, this democracy stuff is so unimportant. We're not going to bother to talk to you about it for your first 10 years of education. And then we're going to give you this one crash course at the end. On the flip side, and Allan alluded to this also, on the flip side, we have, in our state and many others as well, we have what I call mandatory volunteerism, which is my second favorite oxymoron, in case you're wondering, Greg, after jumbo shrimp. But it requires high school students and sometimes middle school students to volunteer a certain number of hours every year. And for all the jokes I can tell about mandatory volunteerism, what I know is that when my students show up at Berkeley and at USC, and they're no longer required to volunteer anymore, those habits have stuck with them, and they keep volunteering. And when they graduate from college, they keep volunteering. And when they get homes and families of their own, they keep volunteering because those habits were instilled in them over several years when they were young. And if we were to institute the kind of civics education program that Allan alluded to a few minutes ago, I think by the time our young people turn 18 years old, campaign finance rules aren't going to seem like nearly as formidable or forbidding an obstacle as they do now, because they'll have spent several years learning that this political process belongs to them. And so, Andrew, I'm going to revise what I said earlier. Instead of doing your sequel on the outcomes, do a sequel on civics education. And between that movie and this one, then you and your colleagues really will change the world.
Yeah, thank you. And I know you've got an event you're going to tell us about in a second. The only sidebar that I'm going to throw of my own into this is that when I taught over the last 5 years, my students were all required to be registered to vote or they failed the course.
Good for you.
But Dan, you've got an event you want to talk about?
Yeah, for anyone who would be interested in it, I host a weekly webinar for the Los Angeles World Affairs Council called Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Next week's webinar airs on Thursdays at 11 Pacific time, 1 p.m. Central time. Next week, I'll be interviewing Congressman Adam Schiff as part of the program. And what I'll send in the chat for those who would like it is a web address to go and register to hear me and Adam talk a little bit about the battles that he's fighting in Washington. I don't think we'll be able to live up to what Allan has put on for you today, but hopefully it's something that some of you will find interesting, and I hope you decide to register and join us.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And before I turn this over to Adam for some closing remarks, I certainly want to thank Andrew for providing us with the film between you and Sarah, we were really really feel very honored that we were able to get an early release to a lot of our people. And I think from the response that we've gotten, it was very well received. I want to thank Greg for having sent you to us in the first place, and also for recruiting Dan to be part of this panel. And Allan, I appreciate your, as my colleague at William Jewell College, for joining us as well. At American Public Square, we're in our 6th year, and our attempt really is, as I've told people in the past, we're not advocates. What we do is we try to have civil, fact-based conversations, and I think tonight, hopefully, was a good example of one, albeit with our next one will be a little more representative of the way America looks. So without further ado, Adam, you want to close us out?
Yeah, and just so all our audience knows, Dan, we can send a link to everyone who's viewed this after the show and to our general audience to let them know about your program. I'm sure a lot of them would be interested. Andrew, one final thing, as we wait with bated breath for the sequel to this film, if I want to watch it again, or if I want to recommend it to my friends, where can we see this in the future? Will it be screening somewhere, or will we be able to find it on online platforms, or what?
Well, thank you for the question, Adam. We are going to be doing screenings in states across the country, but as this all evolves with the coronavirus, it's how much physical versus virtual is still something that Sarah and I are working on very carefully. But we'll be doing a lot of screenings associated with community organizations, educational groups, colleges throughout the rest of the year. It'll be airing nationwide on PBS at the start of next year, in January of next year. So everybody's gotten a very early preview of the film. But thank you again. Thanks for everybody. I was honored to be on this panel, and thanks everybody for taking the time to take this preview and watching it.
And thank you, again, for working with us, for allowing our audience and everyone to have a view of it. Thank you again to the panel and to Ambassador Katz for moderating. A few other programs that are coming up from American Public Square. We have our new podcast series. It's called Both Sides. It's part of our At the Square digital programming. We have a number of them already. You can find them on our website. You can find them on Spotify, Apple, or SoundCloud. Tomorrow we have a discussion about wearing masks and what that means kind of in the COVID era. Both Sides takes a look at these issues from both the left and the right to kind of find the common ground and the disagreements both. And on Tuesday, we will have Kansas City Mayor Quentin Lucas on the podcast as well to talk about developments in Kansas City. On June 8th, we'll have our next Cocktails and Politics event, which will feature political strategist Jeff Rowe to talk about his thoughts on the upcoming elections and what is the future of the Republican Party. Next, coming up in the summer is our Summer Mental Health Series, which is a 3-program series over the summer. It is titled From Resistance to Resilience, the Mental Health of KC Residents. We'll explore the root causes of mental illness in our community and how we can find ways to meaningfully address them. We're going to bring together leading experts and practitioners and Kansas City residents who are invested in the health and well-being of our community to explore mental health through 3 distinct lenses, which are socioeconomics and trauma, policy and politics, and school as community. Finally, as this program ends, we'll be sending out a short survey. We would greatly appreciate if you can take just a few minutes to fill this survey out. It really helps us to understand what we're doing right, what we can improve on, and what kind of programs you want to see. Finally, if you're not a member of American Public Square, we urge you to become one tonight. American Public Square members really help us put together these programs. They help us find all these panelists and bring them together for these important conversations that we're having today. So if you want to learn more, you can go to our website, which is just americanpublicsquare.org, learn more about membership, and contact me if you have any questions about it. So once again, I want to say thank you to all our panelists and to our moderator tonight for an excellent program. I hope everyone has a safe evening, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you all.
Appreciate it.